Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to Pat's Mythos. My name's Pat. I have a new video here for you today, my first non-tag video here on BookTube. Finally ready to start talking some books with you all. Today I wanted to talk about 5 books that I really love that I think deserve more hype around BookTube and the BookTube community. I just want to start by saying that there's a good chance many of you have read these books or have at least heard of them. These are just books that I personally have not seen a lot of discussion about, or at least a lot of other people reading in the communities that I'm a part of. So that's why I'm here today, to bring them to your attention, hopefully get some people to check them out. The first book I want to talk about today is Heroes Die by Matthew Woodring Stover. Okay, if you're familiar with this book at all, there's a decent chance you're only aware of it because of its amazing cover. So let's just take one quick second and take a look at what that amazing cover looks like. All right, now that we've experienced the glory that is that beautiful mass market paperback cover, let's go in and talk about Heroes Die and why I love it so much. So, this is actually book 1 of a series, I think of 4 books, called The Acts of Cain. However, I think it's a pretty decent consensus around readers of the series that you can get away with just reading Heroes Die as a standalone, and that's what I've done. I've heard mixed things about the rest of the books in the series, but don't let that be a deterrent to you, because Heroes Die on its own is just awesome. Heroes Die takes place in a dystopian future where TV stars actually enter parallel realities to go in and have adventures and these crazy quests, while the masses on Earth sit back at home and watch through their VR headsets all the insanity that ensues in the parallel universe. Our main character, Cain, goes into another world where he's always kicking ass, taking names, and just generally being a badass in this basic, I guess you'd say, mid-fantasy world. In the story, you get taste of both the dystopian future and the fantasy world that Cain gets put into. Unfortunately for Cain, something goes terribly wrong while he's in the other dimension, and next thing you know, you're on a crazy adventure as Cain bridges these 2 worlds trying to solve an issue that I won't go too deeply into, but there is a lot of depth to this book. It's actually, I would say, fairly dense at times. It covers some interesting themes about the way we consume entertainment and how violence is so prominent in our society. And when I say this book is violent, I really mean it. The author I think was a martial artist, and it shows because in some of the fight scenes, he very graphically describes like the bones and ligaments and joints that Cain is breaking when he beats the crap out of people. Personally, I thought it was pretty cool, and just generally, this is a badass book with some good depth to it too. It also kind of has this weird like late 90s feel to it, and that's maybe just me knowing it was written in the late 90s, but something about like the campiness of the cover and just reading the book, and it's something about it gave me the vibe of like that mid-90s Mortal Kombat movie, if you've seen it. Everything just blends really well with the time it was written and the feeling of the book. It's just a great time. All right, the second book I want to talk about tonight is City of Thieves by David Benioff. Now, if the name David Benioff sounds familiar, that's David Benioff, who was one of the 2 main writers of Game of Thrones. This is actually a novel he wrote, I think, a few years before he landed Game of Thrones as the next big part of his career. Don't worry, while he couldn't stick the landing on Game of Thrones, this is an all-around awesome book, I think sitting at around 300 pages. So this is actually historical fiction. This takes place during World War II in Russia during the Siege of Leningrad. If you're at all familiar with the Siege of Leningrad or anything like it, this is a really intense book at parts because of just the brutality and insanity that humans will go to when they're stuck with limited rations and food and under the pressure of military conflict. So this is a really interesting look at not necessarily military conflict between large armies, but how humans turn on each other during these types of situations. It follows our main character, Lev, as he gets into some trouble with the military. Clearly a very intense atmosphere going on during a siege during that time, and the rough elements of the winter. You really feel like you're transported back. Now, the entire premise of this story is that during the siege, while food is limited and everyone's going through a hard time, to save himself, Lev is tasked by a high-level officer in the Russian military to find a dozen eggs for the military officer's daughter's birthday party. And that sounds like maybe a low-level, silly premise, but the adventure that ensues is just amazing, and it's just an all-around awesome book, one of my absolute favorites. Next up at number 3, we have Spoonbenders by Daryl Gregory. So this was a 2018 Nebula nominee. I actually stumbled upon it at my local library. This was sort of before I had all the huge list of huge TBR that I have now and a ton of recommendations. It looked interesting, so I picked it up without any prior knowledge, and I actually really enjoyed it. So Spoonbenders is what I guess you would call magical realism. It talks about the American Telemachus family. They were a psychic family that made the TV late night rounds in the 1970s. You learn a little bit about that, and then you're transported to the 1990s where the family's pretty washed up. However, they still have their psychic powers, and it makes for a really interesting story. You can kind of imagine this as like the X-Files mixed with Modern Family or This Is Us. There's these really good family aspects, but it's all a little bit more of a lighter tone, I'd say. A lot of fun, and everyone has different powers. For example, one of the daughters can always tell if someone's lying, which makes for really interesting family dynamics. And one of the brothers, who's the funniest character in the book, has a telekinetic power, so he can move things with his mind. So here we are in the 90s following the Telemachus family as things have just clearly not gone great since their 15 minutes of fame in the 1970s. We have them have the government after them for various reasons, the mobs after them, and the family is just going through a difficult time. Even though I'd say the book has a more fun, jovial tone, there's some good moments, some pretty intense moments, I'd say, and the climax and the ending of this book are pretty awesome. I think any fantasy fan could find this a really solid palate cleanser or just a good, easier read in between the big chonkers. Number 4 is Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky. Now, Adrian Tchaikovsky puts out a lot of books, so I wouldn't be surprised if most people miss this. So this is one of his novellas that he put out, I want to say in 2021 or 2022. So we're talking really quick here, just maybe 200 pages. And I would put this in the realm of sci-fi, fantasy, kind of a mesh, which I'll get into here in a second. Now, personally, I'm not a huge fan of novellas, but this one was able to pack a really awesome punch in a very short page count. So I'll start with the sci-fi aspect of things. We have a planetary anthropologist who's living on a planet studying the societies there. One day he's approached by a far more primitive society, and so then I'll switch to the fantasy side of things. This far more primitive society comes to the anthropologist for help with a dire threat, and they actually view him as this sort of wizard. They don't fully understand that there is this whole other universe out there, and they're actually being studied by the anthropologist. And so this really interesting blend of mysticism versus science as we watch this sci-fi perspective from the anthropologist with the POVs of some of the members of the society as they view things in a much more mystical and fantastical way. In the end, it makes for a real genre bender that can sometimes feel like sci-fi and other times feel like fantasy. And trust me, it's really great for just under 200 pages. And last but not least, number 5 is A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles. Now, here's another historical fiction recommendation for you. And now I'm just realizing that here, Gentleman in Moscow and City of Thieves are actually both set in Russia and kind of in the 20th century, but they're completely different, trust me. Now, I'll admit, I'm a little biased putting this recommendation on here because A Gentleman in Moscow is actually one of my all-time favorite books, maybe in my top 5 ever. So A Gentleman in Moscow is about a prim and proper member of the Russian nobility who's ordered by the Kremlin to spend out the rest of his days living in a single hotel in Moscow, and he's never allowed to leave to avoid being executed. Now, that might sound kind of boring, but trust me, Amor Towles is such a great author. He just makes this such a fun and kind of whimsical, charming read. You follow this kind of dandy, intellectual member of the nobility as he has to adjust to this much more, I guess you'd say, modest lifestyle, living in a hotel for the rest of his life. And as this book goes over the decades that he lives there, you really get to know the staff and understand the hotel, and there's a really good found family aspect here. There's just so many heartfelt moments in this book, it just honestly could bring a tear to my eye thinking about them. It really is one of my all-time favorite books. All right, everybody. Thank you if you've stayed this long, tuned into this video. I really enjoyed making this first video here to talk about some actual books. If you have any other recommendations for videos you'd like to see from me, please feel free to drop a comment down below. I'm really excited to get started here on BookTube, and I really hope that some of you will get to enjoy the books I talked about here today. Have a good one. Thanks.